We're closing in. We've done, 5,800 years of our 6,000-year history, so we're getting there. We're just about to get to Tsarist Russia today and to get us to the stage where we want to be. We're narrowing the focus. We have dealt primarily, interestingly enough, with Islam and Christianity in Europe, doing violence first to each other and then internally to their own religions. So our focus is going to get sharper today as we zero in on the people who actually produce the literature that we're going to start reading. It's going to get narrow. It's going to get down to one people in this geography, one ethnic group, even though every ethnic group could have written a literature like this, because it's a literature that examines their own internal values within the frame of reference of a particular religion and asks, how did we get here, and what are we doing to ourselves? This book, we got 2 Albanians in the class. It could have been written about Albanian civilization. It could be written about Italians, about Irish, about Germans, about Ethiopians, about Kenyans, about Pakistanis or Indians. Every ethnic group that exists on the earth could have written a literature like the one you're going to examine. From whatever perspective, many of them probably have, the conflict between generations at a particular moment in time. But we got to get there first. We still haven't completed our journey. Okay, and if you have a question about any of this, get up to me afterwards or even raise your hand. We can stop and have a little discussion, but we're going to keep punching ahead now. When we talked about schism with Christianity and Islam, we talked about violence. When were the 2 great Christian schisms? Give me the dates. I love dates. 2 dates. Yeah, you're close. 10? 5th. When did the two popes excommunicate each other? What year? 1054. Then came the one more recent to us. I did find a Lutheran in the class, by the way, Ryan. I found Ryan, and Ryan is a Lutheran, and he I think he even knew when Reformation Day was, October 31st. But what was the year that Luther nailed those 95 complaints about the Catholic Church on the door of the University Church? 1517. So 1054, 1517, those are the 2 dates of Christian schism that led first to some violence, and then the second one, unbelievable violence. I mean, Christians killing Christians became just extraordinary. With Islam, it happened even sooner, when the Sunni and the Shia began struggling, and their conflagration was really terrible. After the 30 Years' War, when we saw the final butchery between Christians killing Christians, we entered this period of the 18th century that we call the Age of Reason, the Age of Enlightenment, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and finally we get to what amounts to a schism, a fracturing of the Jewish world, but it didn't happen with guns. If they had them, they would have used them. If there had been a schism for the Jews in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Israelites or the Hebrews, they were violent. They would have used weapons. They would have killed each other, as they did. But now it's going to be something else. It's going to be a schism of ideas, because that ultimately is what happened to the Jews of... Ooh, how do I do my thing? Oh. To the Jews of Europe, who are low profile. Okay, where the Jews amidst Christian slaughter, hiding out as best they possibly can, not having a problem. Initially Luther said, I love the Jews. Won't you embrace my new religion? They said, no, thank you. And he said, I hate the Jews. He turned on the Jews violently. This is the kind of Europe that we've got now. And then Islam gets pushed back, and the hatred that's still going on in Northern Ireland. So the people who came into the office yesterday had no idea that Catholics and Protestants are still fighting each other in Northern Ireland. Interesting. Here's the 18th century, the Age of Reason, and here we are. The Jews of Europe in 1750, 2 revolutions and schisms for the Jews. Where are the Jews? They're located primarily in Germany still, after they got driven out of England, France, Spain, and then they're also located now in what is really Poland and Russia. Those are the 2 great concentrations. Let's dismiss the first one that's not our subject, and that is what happened in Western Europe, the path to modernism and assimilation. This is a story that's not our story. Just like we passed over the Sephardic Jews of Spain, we're going to pass over these, but because it's of interest to a lot of people in the room, we want to talk a little bit about it. This is the guy who made it all happen. When you talk about disabilities, physical disabilities, there are a couple of great examples in literature of people who are physically disabled. I think the most interesting example in English literature is Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope, who was a great 18th century poet, had a hump, he was 4'11", he was deformed, he was really, but a brilliant, brilliant mind. This guy, whose original name was Moses ben Mendel, as all the Jews were named. They only had one way of naming a Jew in Europe. And what was it? So-and-so, son of so-and-so. You were a daughter, you were a son, you were Moses ben Mendel. How many Moses ben Mendels do you think there were? Thousands. They had no idea, but they got Moses ben Mendels all over the place. This guy, right in the middle of the 18th century, he single-handedly knocked the ghetto walls down in Germany. Remarkable guy. He led a rational revolution. He left the German ghetto from 1750 to 1800. This is when it all happened. And it started with a census. I went through this class and found a bunch of names. Some of you are Jews, some of you are not. But the names are all of what etymological extraction? They're all German. They're all etymology. In the 18th century, there was nothing that looked like Germany today. There was this big thing in the middle. There was a great Austrian empress named Maria Theresia and a lot of princes. Maria Theresia got the idea, I have no idea how many Jews are in my empire. The only way we're going to find out is to have a census. So a rule went out that said within the next 3 months, every Jew has to take a name that's identifiable. And that began the first census of the Jews of Europe, of Germany particularly, of the German-speaking lands. Now, for a small fee, you got to pick your own name. So if you look at these names, otherwise you could pick, the easiest thing was to do what? Moses ben Mendel, alternate to, what are the common names of Europe? Mendelssohn, but think of Scandinavia. Hans Christian Andersen. The easiest thing for a person to do is take the son of and turn it into the vulgar language, the Vulgate that you're using. Anderson, whatever it is, Smithson, Johnson, it's easiest, son of that. It's the easiest way to do it is that way. They're also very common. But the Jews, or even non-Jews, some of you got names like this, of the German lands. Arzt. What's an Arzt in German? A doctor. Well, I want to be called Samuel Doctor, Shmuel Doctor, or something like that. Baum. I love nature, so I'll call myself Louis Tree, right? A doctor, a tree. What is a beautiful tree? A pear tree, a Birnbaum. Oh, it's a beautiful word, Birnbaum, a pear tree. Edelstein. Stein is stone. Edel, noble. Edelstein, a precious stone. An Edelstein. What a lovely name. Okay. Engel. Oh, if I'm going to be an angel, I want to be an angel. What's an angel? An angel. So you pick a name like Engel. Gottbaum, a tree of God, God's tree. Woohoo! Greenberg or Grünberg, if you want it in original German. The E was a U and an umlaut, or a U and an E. So Grünberg, Green Mountain. That's what Vermont was going to be called if the Germans won out. Who won out in the naming of that part of the country? It's called Vermont. Greenberg, but it's what language? French. Vermont. So the French immigrants got to pick the name. The Germans lost out. The Americans, the English speakers wanted to call it the Green Mountain State. So it's still called Green Mountain up there. Green. Schneider, profession. A profession. You name yourself after your profession. If you have a business that you can do. If you're a Schneider, but that's not just a Jewish name. A lot of people named Snyder or Schneider. You're a tailor. Steinberg, a mountain made up of stones or diamonds. Weiskind. Well, Weiss is cognate to English to what word? Wise, kind, child, a wise child. Now, sometimes if you didn't want to pick a name, some of the Orthodox Jews said, no, I am not picking a name. I am going to remain Moses ben Mendel. The authorities had the power to give you a name. So you're not going to get a name. Your name is Onion. Zwiebel. You're going to be called Onion. Or how would you like a name like penis? Schlange, a snake, but it's also a circumlocution. Or urine. Would you like a name like urine? Goldwasser. Goldwasser, gold water. So the naming of people in the 18th century became an art. And the German Jews picked it. The German Gentiles also found names like this. There are a lot of German names named after professions, named after whatever you did, and the Jews got in there. So Jewish names and non-Jewish German names are indistinguishable. One of the great Nazis, his name was Rosenberg, Rosemountain. But Alfred Rosenberg was a monster, and he was a German, and he had a name that many Jews had as a name. So you really can't tell. The names are just of Germanic extraction, and this census then came along and produced the kind of impact that we wanted to have in creating. So that was the census that gave them a sense. It's then the 18th century that took over. I mentioned a couple of names the last time. The Age of Reason, Kant, Goethe, Voltaire, Pope, Thomas Jefferson. These were people who had no room or no time for hating people's ethnicity. They really didn't bother, or religion. Hatred of religion, hatred of people, these guys were above it. They said, no more, enough. Particularly this hatred of the Jews. That we hate each other, that's stupid, Protestant and Catholic, it's insanity, it's stupid. He said, and knock it off with the Jews. All of these people, people of the Age of Reason, men who were the finest minds in the 18th century, and they then had an occasion to read essays, and they read a brilliant essay written in German by anonymous. There were anonymous essay contests. Goethe and Schiller read it. Goethe read it, said, who is this guy? Called forward the guy, the prize winner, and up walks a little 4'11" humpback Jew with a stutter. It was Moses Mendelssohn, who turned out to be a gift. These people embraced him. They said, you're now part of our coterie, you're part of our world. And Mendelssohn was embraced by Kant, Goethe, Schiller, Lessing, all the great minds of 18th century Germany. Mendelssohn then had an idea. When he was a kid, he walked at the age of 13 from his home in Dessau to Berlin. And then in Berlin, he said, I want to become a German. Or I want to be there wasn't a Jew in all of Germany who could speak German. Mendelssohn said, I will learn German. I will become a German because I believe that I can stay an Orthodox, observant Jew with all 613 commandments and also become a German. That was Mendelssohn's hope, Mendelssohn's dream, and Mendelssohn made it happen. So he went from Moses ben Mendel to Moses Mendelssohn and became a good German, remained a pious Jew. He believed also that the key to breaking down the ghetto walls was to get the Jews to learn German and to forget this ugly language from the Middle Ages that was their common denominator in the ghetto. That language was Yiddish. How do we get rid of Yiddish? That was Moses Mendelssohn's one big important call, and he did it. How would he do it? If the Jews couldn't read the Roman letters, what do you think he could do? He translated the Hebrew Bible. He translated the Hebrew Bible. How? He translated it into German, but he knew that the Jews couldn't read the Roman letters. So what did he do? He wrote the Hebrew Bible in German from right to left using Hebrew letters. He did that, and then 4 years later, when the Jews had heard the sound of German, he then translated the Bible into German, writing from left to right with the Roman letters. He single-handedly took Yiddish out of the ghetto and destroyed it. Then came the events of the 18th century. It was, besides Mendelssohn, there was also one other figure I mentioned the other day from France who also went over throughout Europe and smashed down ghettos. Who was the universal ghetto smasher, wall smasher, who said all of this stuff is over? French emperor? Napoleon. Napoleon did it in Germany also. He went in, and the first thing he did when he conquered a city or conquered a duchy was to knock down the ghetto walls and tell the Jews, you are now citizens of the state. Napoleon gave the Jews equality. He gave the equality in France. He gave them the equality wherever they happened to go. So it became a good German. Instantly, the Jew got out of the ghetto and found German culture, German civilization, and said, this is wonderful. It was the end. Within one generation, Yiddish was gone. When the ghetto walls were knocked down in Germany, within one generation, it was over with. Marx, Freud, Einstein, Kafka. What language did they write in? They wrote in German. They knew Yiddish a little bit. They had heard Yiddish a little bit, but it was no longer their native language. And the German Jew was emancipated out of the ghetto thanks to the events of the 18th century and to the efforts of Moses Mendelssohn. How do you think the rabbis handled this? They didn't like it at all. The rabbis were interested in keeping two sets of walls around the Jews. One set that the outside world put around them, and then another set that they put around them. They wanted to keep the Jews inside without being affected by the outside world. It was the end of Yiddish among German Jews. Marx, Freud, Einstein, Kafka, right? Okay. Now the Jews as Germans, this is a whole other course. This is another 14 weeks or a life of study if you're interested in it. The Jew as a German, language, culture, and faith. They absorbed the German language by the end of the 1800s, end of the 1700s, going into the 1800s. Their life, they saw Germany as their paradise. They also, with the downing of the ghetto walls, realized, why do I have to stop just becoming emancipated as a German? If I want, I can take one more step and head to the baptismal fountain. What is everybody praying for? What do Christians pray for? What have they been praying for 500 years? Pray for the conversion of the Jews. And so the Jews of Germany say, man, this is my big chance. And it was a wholesale race to the baptismal fountain. It was assimilation with a vengeance. The German Jews said, I don't need this. I don't need the rabbis. I don't need the ghetto. I don't need the 613 commandments. I now know German. I love this culture. I love this civilization. And I'm not stopping at this. I'm heading for the baptismal fountain. But something else had happened at the same time. In the 19th century, a new sort of pseudoscience had come along. We have a word today, people study genetics. Genetics, you know what it is. It's a rigorous discipline, a rigorous science. It's like the relationship between, before there was astronomy, what was there? Before there was astronomy, there was astrology. Before there was genetics, there was eugenics. Eugenics was not so good science. But it led to the German Jew, it led him into the great tragedy of 19th century Germany and ultimately of 20th century Germany. And that was the belief that the German Jew had, based on 500 years of Christian history, that if you took a Jew and put him in a baptismal fountain and took him out, you came out what? A Christian. But the field of eugenics said, you take a Jew and put him in a baptismal fountain and you take him out, you got a wet Jew. That baptism meant nothing. The German Jew didn't want to hear that and didn't want to believe it, but the eugenicists said that's what happens. So the German Jew was tragic from the beginning, trying to figure out what? What was the question of his life? How do I become more and more German? How do I become more and more German? I want to really be a German. If I have to become a Christian, I'll become a Christian. So, into marriage, all of Mendelssohn's children into marriage. Moses Mendelssohn died an Orthodox Jew. He would not travel on the Sabbath. When Frederick the Great, another great figure of the 18th century, said, come visit me. You are a very special person. I want you to visit me and my court. Come this Saturday. Mendelssohn wrote back and said, sorry, I don't travel on Sabbath. Told that to the emperor? So it was really a little scary. What am I doing?
Can I just...
Sure. Okay, here we go again. That's all right, you'll hear it whenever you go. And so Moses Mendelssohn would not travel and died an Orthodox observant Jew. His children all converted. His grandson is who? Musician, great composer, Midsummer Night's Dream, The Overture. Felix Bartholdy Mendelssohn. Felix Mendelssohn is the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn. When he thought of himself as a Catholic, he was a Christian. He believed it. He wrote a Christian opera. He wrote Christian music. He wrote Christian oratorios. And then when the Nazis came, they ripped down every one of his monuments because they considered Felix Mendelssohn still only a baptized Jew. So you could never escape it, as much as the German Jew tried desperately to escape the idea that he was anything but a German, because that's really what they wanted to be. They wanted to be Germans. So after Mendelssohn, after Napoleon, this race to the baptismal fountain, the embrace of German culture, the desire to be a German. The rabbis were going crazy. They didn't know what to do. So they ultimately said, if we can't stop it, maybe we can adapt to it. And the German rabbis decided, how do we go along with this as best we possibly can? And the 19th century, early 19th century German rabbis decided they needed a new form of Judaism. And they invented this new form of Judaism that they called Reform Judaism. They had to create a new way of doing it. What did it mean? Go as far as you can to being German, and at the same time, try to hold on to whatever Jewishness you can. So they moved the services from Saturday to Sunday. They brought organs in. They got rid of the most obnoxious characteristics of the 613. What would they be? What would some of the characteristics that you could dump, some of the commandments that you could dump that would make you look more like a Gentile? Kosher, the kosher food. So one of the earliest things that went was the requirement that that your animals were ritually killed, separation. So all of that went among the German Jews. They immediately jumped into a new kind of cuisine. What else? Separation of sexes in the religious environment. The separation of men and women in the synagogue. That wall went down, men and women came together. The language used in religious observance, no longer Hebrew, but the service was conducted in German. So they wanted to look like Germans, they wanted to act like Germans, they wanted to be Germans. They didn't want to be called Jews. They took names like, we are Israelites, we are Mosaicites, we're anything, but just don't call me a Jew. And the German Jew did this as desperately as he possibly can. And as far as they were concerned, it worked. The rabbis held off. They created this new kind of Judaism out of Germany that was... So the German Jew before Hitler was a unique individual. It's not our subject. We're not going to talk any more about them in the next 2 or 3 minutes. But they were unique in that they desperately wanted to assimilate and modernize. And it was through Moses Mendelssohn's effort, even though that's not what he intended. Moses Mendelssohn did not want the Jew to disappear. He wanted the Jew to stay observant, to be Orthodox, but still be a patriotic, modern German, and above all, what else could you do? You had to get rid of some of the things that the ghetto insisted on: the Jewish star, the Jewish hat, the Jewish nose, the Jewish funniness. Stop dressing like a Jew. You could dress if you could pass. The whole idea was, how do we pass? But what emerged out of it was an extraordinary race to assimilation and into marriage. If Hitler hadn't come along, by now, the German Jew would probably be gone. But not through murder or slaughter or killing. They would have gone how? Assimilation. They simply would have assimilated. They were German, they wanted to be German, and that is the story, unique story of the German Jew, a subject that you can study on your own, but it's in many ways it's a tragic story, because when Hitler came to power, he came to power with about 10 to 15% of the Jewish vote, because when Hitler talked about the East European Jews, they thought, hey, he doesn't mean us, because Hitler was very smart. He used to talk about meine Juden. He talked about meine Juden. What does that mean? Does some of you know a little German? My Jews. And they thought he meant us, the German Jews, of whom there were only 600,000, 1% of the population. He meant them, and we were safe. So when the Nazis came to power in 1933, the German Jews said, don't worry, it'll pass, it'll pass, it'll pass. 1935 came the Nuremberg laws on race. If you had two Jewish grandparents, you were a Jew. They kept saying, it'll pass, it'll pass, it'll pass. Then 1938, all the synagogues were burned down in Kristallnacht, and the Jew began realizing, this ain't gonna pass. And so the majority of the German Jews left between 1938 and 1940, the last possible moment, because they could not conceive that they could live anywhere else except Germany. So that was their home, and that was it. And that was a world that was unique, and we're going on for it. Anybody got any questions you want to ask before we leave them? Because that's not our subject. They had the same influence, by the way, in all of Western Europe. The French Jews, the English Jews, they all assimilated. Scandinavian Jews. There were 7,000 Jews in Denmark. They were all blonde and blue-eyed, but they were Jews, and they were all modernized. They were all part of the modern assimilationist movement that came out of Germany and that started with Moses Mendelssohn. Okay? Look like everybody, you can pass. You can look like anybody else and be anybody else. And that was the end of that. That's the end of that particular time. Now in the East, and this is where we are. This is where we zero in now. In the East, another path to the past and to the Messiah. That's where we're going, and that's where we're staying. A contemporary, he lived the same years as Moses Mendelssohn. His name was, Israel ben Eliezer. This guy never even had a real name. He never took any name. He was always Israel, the son of Eliezer. He was given a name by his followers, in Hebrew, the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. We don't even know when he was born, around 1700, and he died in 1760. So almost a direct contemporary of Moses Mendelssohn. But this guy started another faith, another aspect of Judaism that emerged out of the mysticism, the Kabbalah, the irrationalism, and all of that sense of messianic Jewish fervor that started back with Jesus and continued. That messianic tradition among Jews that started way back and now is reborn again. This is, if Moses Mendelssohn is the ultimate intellect, what is this guy? The ultimate anti-intellect. And the movement that the Baal Shem Tov advocated, direct communication with God, in the midst of our misery and sadness, let's find joy and happiness. You talk directly to God, you don't need any intermediary. And this now becomes the cornerstone of the kind of Judaism that flourishes in Eastern Europe. Anti-intellectual, direct communication with God, and it swept over the misery and poverty of the millions of Jews who lived in Eastern Europe. And the rabbis didn't like this guy at all, because they lost control over him. He left no writings. This guy didn't, like Jesus, he didn't publish. This guy wrote nothing. He lived, and his memory lived because of his followers. He was such a charismatic leader. In many ways, Jesus was charismatic. St. Paul was charismatic. The Baal Shem Tov, Israel ben Eliezer, was a charismatic, itinerant wanderer. We don't even know if he could write, but he was an itinerant. And what do we know? If you've watched any televangelists, what could this guy do? He could speak. He could preach. Did any of you ever watch the televangelists? They're really, some of these young guys are up there, and they get up there, and they are absolutely filled with the Spirit. They're really quite remarkable. The Baal Shem Tov, Israel ben Eliezer, was a charismatic preacher, and found people who simply said, this is my path to God. He was they called him a miracle worker. He could raise the dead. He could do this. Lots of legends circled around him. And he created a faith in his lifetime and then afterwards that was very special, a God for the wretched. The Jews of Eastern Europe, 1750 to 1800, just the same time as Mendelssohn is creating this intellectual assimilationist Judaism, this guy is creating something else in Eastern Europe that's quite remarkable. He was a different pious revolutionary, different kind of guy, a revolutionary nonetheless, upset the rabbis terribly. The rabbis wanted order and their control of the ghetto. These two guys, Mendelssohn on one side and the Baal Shem Tov on the other, they weren't having any of it. He had an idea, and his idea is God is everywhere and understands. All you have to do is talk directly to God, and God will answer you, and he will fill your heart with joy. So he said, you can dance your way to heaven. And for whatever reason, the Jews of Eastern Europe were ready for this guy's message and the message that his followers had. He threw off sparks, they said, and people would pick up the sparks that he threw off and carry them forward. His followers were called the pious ones, and in Hebrew they were given a name, the Hasidim. Serve God with joy in your heart. So forget the rules. Forget the 613 rules. Just serve God and be happy. There is a personal path. You can speak to God because God speaks Yiddish. God speaks Yiddish. You talk to God, he'll answer you. And he'll answer you in Yiddish. So it was not German. It was not assimilationist. It was not the languages of the modern world. It was the language of the ghetto that the Baal Shem Tov embraced. Hasidim, the pious followers, the sparks of life, of light. These guys would say, he has given me his spark. I have taken the spark from the Baal Shem Tov, and I will carry that spark everywhere. And they became leaders of their own courts. There were a couple hundred of them initially. They're down now to about 30 or 40 different Hasidic courts that exist in the world. There are 8 major ones. 6 of them are in the United States, and another 30 spread out between Israel, maybe even a couple in Europe, and many of them in the United States. These sparks, and it's personal, and that's when they gave him the name, the master of the good name, the Baal Shem Tov. And it's the legacy of Hasidism because he said, Messiah is coming, Moshiach. Hasidism is an evangelical, Jewish, messianic movement. That's what it is. They are messianic. They are overwhelmed with the spirit of the Messiah who will be here anymore. When was the last time this happened in a big-time way? It happened every once in a while during the 1,000 years. But when was the last great, enormous messianic Jewish movement? When was it? We looked at it 1,000 years, 1,800 years before. Where was the first great Jewish messianic movement? What did it produce? It produced Jesus and Christianity. But it was a messianic movement for Jews. And this is another one, the legacy of Hasidism. Moshiach, where is the Messiah? So they were expecting the Messiah, they're waiting for the Messiah, and they are still waiting for the Messiah because the Hasidic movement today is still evangelical, messianic, apocalyptic, and waiting for the Messiah to come. They believe in miracles. They are very deep into the Kabbalah. They believe that God's wisdom is communicated by dreams. And they're also dynastic. This is important. They're dynastic. What does it mean by dynastic? The kings of England are dynastic. What about Hasidism that's dynastic? Your spark is handed off to your son or some relative that is appropriate. So, in other words, they're really living the struggle that Islam had. Which group of Islam wanted it to be dynastic? The Shia. The Shia wanted dynastic. The Sunni did not, and the Shia won. Here, Hasidism says we are dynastic. and we hand it on to a spark. So some of the Hasidic leaders today go back 300 years to a relative of 300 years ago, because that spark is passed on and handed on. I mean, it's something that you have a chance to really get within the current context. About 15 or 20 years ago, as I said, there are about 6 or 8 major Hasidic courts. They are, can I get to that one? They range from the south. The movement really overwhelmed southern Russia and southern Poland. That's where it had its greatest strength, in the south. It got as far north as a little village in what's currently Lithuania called Lubavitch. And that's and there was a rabbi who also became the spark. And that was the further north you got, the less emotional and the less apocalyptic it became, the less hysterical it became in many ways. And so between the northern reaches of Hasidism, Lubavitch, and the south, where you have other villages and other towns with Hasidic leaders, you get various kinds of attitude toward how they see their movement going. About 15 or 20 years ago, the most rational of them, the least extraordinary of them, the least emotional of them, decided they were going to reach out to American Jews who were assimilating. So they went and bought houses on or near 400 college campuses in the United States. We've got one here, about 4 or 5 blocks, and it is one of the courts of Hasidism, the one that furthest north, the most rational one, the Lubavitch movement. And we have a rabbi here who's on near the campus, who is also evangelical and messianic, and is also waiting for Moshiach. That's the common denominator of Hasidism, really, the various courts that exist out here. This is the soil where Yiddish culture grew. This is the world that we're going to start reading about in the literature very shortly. All the people we read about are followers of some Hasidic rabbi, or Rebbe, as they called him. So that's the soil where Yiddish lived. All the people come out of this environment that we encounter in the literature. And it still grows today, because Hasidism is still very much alive. It is a branch of Judaism that's very, very much alive. I mean, if you ever seen them in real action, I happened to experience it about 30 years ago. I went to pick up somebody at an airport then. Actually, it was more than that. It was because it was called Idlewild Airport. It wasn't Kennedy Airport. It was the airport in New York on Long Island. And I went there to pick somebody up. And all of a sudden, the DC-3 comes rolling in. And I'm standing around there, about 300 guys in black hats and black caftans who are moaning and groaning and pushing up against a fence. And all of a sudden, the door of the DC-3 opens up, and out comes a bag of bones about 75 pounds, 190 years old, a little scrawny guy dressed in black with a huge, long gray beard and a couple of canes coming off the plane, at which point the 300 guys in the black hats go crazy, push down the fence, grab this guy off the airplane, and carry him along the Belt Parkway, dancing the whole way to Brooklyn. I said, what the hell is this? And somebody said, it's the Zatmar Hasidim. They had big beaver hats on, and they love their Rebbe. They love their rabbi. And so Hasidism is an acquired taste. It's something you have to get a sense of what it's all about. Here are a bunch of Lubavitcher Hasidim trying to look as modern as they can, because they are the most modernized group of Hasidim. Here they're sitting with President Reagan. They all got to look like, but they all, they think we look just like everybody else. That's their goal. They wanted to look like everybody else. Not quite, but they got close. They're all sitting there and watching him sign a decree. So Hasidism is in the modern world, and it is an official branch of Judaism. We're going to study it. It's important for us because of the people we're going to read about, the characters in the literature. This is the iconic expression of Hasidism. What's this guy doing? What's he doing? He's singing and talking to God. He's singing and talking to God, saying, I know the Messiah is coming. It's Hasidic joy in finding God. They are emotional. You know, Christianity has the same. They have people who talk in tongues. Christianity can get extraordinarily emotional, evangelical. Evangelical Hasidism, this is it. In Islam, the Sufis, what do? Some of the Sufis are called whirling dervishes. Woohoo! They get going. So each branch of these three religions has one group where there is an emotional outpouring that is extraordinary. And the Hasidim are that aspect of it. So that's the theological, that's the schism. There couldn't be any more dramatic schism between East and West than between what Moses Mendelssohn did and what the Baal Shem Tov did. That is the extent of the Jewish schism. Those that bought into modernism assimilated or became reformed. Those that bought into the tradition stayed in the 18th century. One was Yiddish, the other modern languages, and it's this world that's the world that we're going to examine because it's the world where our literature emerges. Any questions? Somebody got a question? Just understand what the nature of this split was. For the Jews of Eastern Europe, now we're going to get into the politics and history of it again as we get into the 19th century. From the 18th century, it went from bad to worse. The Jews were in one gigantic ghetto. The Dark Ages for the Jews continue. The 18th century brought rationalization to the Jews of Western Europe, but for the Jews of Eastern Europe, it never went good. And now we have to talk about people. Hold on a little bit. Don't get yourself bored, and keep these people in mind because it's the 18th century. The first major person we want to just put on your radar screen is Catherine the Great. She was Catherine II. She lived, again, 18th century, right in the middle. From 1762 to 1796, that's 34 years, she was the empress of what? Russia. She was the empress, but she was the Tsarina. She was the big 800-pound gorilla of Russia. She was a German princess. She was a German princess, a Lutheran, and she was German, right? Here's a great picture of her from the 18th century when she was at her most German best on a horse. And then she married, she was engaged. Well, what kind of marriages were made in Europe? It still is. You get what kind of marriages are there among the royalty? Arranged marriages. So she was arranged to marry a dimwit Russian heir to Tsarevich to the Russian throne. His name was Paul. He was a bit of a boob, but she was married to him. Within a matter of a very short time, he was dead, and she was the Tsarina. So she took care of him. She was a political shark. She's one of the great 18th century figures of European politics. And she and the great German Prussian ruler, Frederick the Great, and the great Austrian ruler, Maria Theresia, got together and concocted an idea that would make Poland disappear. The disappearance of Poland. Poland is a major nation, the geopolitics of Prussia, Austria, and Russia. The disappearance of Poland between 1772 and 1795. At the end of the 18th century, Poland was, anybody study this part of European history? What's it called? Poland was partitioned 3 different times until Poland was gone. From 1772 to 1795. There was Poland. It was a country. It had millions of Jews in it. There was Russia. But they were going to lose. And here they saw which piece goes here, this piece goes there, that piece goes there, and Poland gets smaller in 1772. The second partition, 1793, Prussia grabs this piece, Russia grabs this piece, Austria didn't get anything in this one. This is what's left of Poland. Not much. Second partition. And finally, the third partition of Poland, Russia and Prussia grab the rest, and Polish is gone. Anybody of Polish extraction in this room? Anybody's got some Polish blood? People always talk about Polish jokes. What do they mean about Polish jokes? What's the stereotype? We talked about stereotyping Jews, stereotyping gypsies. What's the stereotype of the Polish joke? That the Poles are supposedly dumb. That's a stereotype. You create that. You tell that to Chopin, you tell that to Madame Curie, that they were dumb. Well, that's the stereotype that people use. The tragedy of Poland, is that Poland is its geographic tragedy. Why is it a geographic tragedy? Poles tell a joke. They say, if we're ever again invaded by Germany and Russia, first we'll wipe out the Germans, then we'll wipe out the Russians, because with us it's always business before pleasure. Is that the way it works out for the Poles? The Poles are screwed by geography because they are located between two countries that never, ever take their eye off Poland. This was the first disappearance of Poland. When was the second disappearance of Poland? Who else chewed up Poland? When? 1939. The Nazis and the Soviets, when they were allies, they came in and Poland once again disappeared from the map of Europe. But now, from 1795 to when? When did Poland come back? When did Poland come back? International relations majors, come on. When did Poland come back? She knows. She's got a headache, but she knows. No. What treaty, I gave you the key, brought them back? The Treaty of Versailles reconstituted Poland. Poland was gone from the map of Europe from 1795 to 1919. And it stayed there, it stayed in Europe then from 1919 to 1939. And then from 39 to 45, gone again. And then what happened in 45? The map of Poland simply shifted. Poland gets a third of Germany, and Russia, the USSR, gets a third of Poland. And so Poland is always there. Poland always has this great tragedy that's going on, that's circling around it. So Poland is divided up. Now, here we are, the Jews of Eastern Europe, from creation to journey's end. When's creation? From Adam and Eve to where they wind up in Eastern Europe with our literature. The Jews in 19th century Tsarist Russia. In Western, let's just recapitulate. In Western Europe, we got, what do we got? Assimilation in the modern world, right? Look at you. I mean, which part of your tradition? America. What does America do to you? What does this country do to you? It makes you all look alike. I can't tell a Jew from a Gentile, from a Christian, from an, only if you're a different color can I tell you that you're not a Caucasian, but you all look alike. There's no distinction between any of you. There's just no way you can. Assimilation in the modern world. America has this ability to assimilate everyone, get everybody to look and dress alike. Assimilation in the modern world. Intermarriage. That's marriage. The Jews are intermarrying in the United States, 2 out of 3, so their intermarriage is big here. But in Europe, it was enormous. The 19th century was big-time intermarriage. Reform Judaism is the new face of Western Judaism. This reform thing that makes you look as much like a Gentile as possible. Orthodox Judaism is fading. In Western Europe, there were no Hasidim. They were strictly in the East. In America, and then there was immigration already in the 19th century, the German Jews came over here, and if they thought they could find freedom in Germany, what do they find over here? Man, 5 minutes later, I'm gone, right? My name may be Schoenberg, but in 10 minutes, I am called Schoenberg. I can turn that into French. So what's the French of Auguste Schoenberg? He says, I'm going to take a French name. Schoenberg means, somebody knows something about languages here? Schoenberg. Schön? Oh, du bist so schön. Schön means what? I have to wait here for the next 25 minutes to get an answer. Schön. Does anybody know what schön means in German? Beautiful, pretty, beautiful. Schön, Berg. Berg we already talked about. Steinberg, Berg, a mountain. Baum is tree. Berg. Schön Berg means what? Pretty mountain. I want to turn that into French. Come on, somebody knows some French. Belmont. So that becomes the guy who creates the big famous racetrack in New York, whose name is Auguste Belmont. He's an Episcopalian. Why? Because 10 minutes after he comes to this country, you can change your name and go, poof, I'm an Episcopalian. That's it. It's over. You go into the baptismal fountain and you become an Episcopalian. Your kids become Episcopalian. They can go to Harvard. They can go to Yale because Harvard and Yale are taking Episcopalians. And it all works out beautifully for the German Jew in America. A chance to really assimilate and disappear. Now, Catherine has got another plan for the Jews. She, with the division of Poland, she inherits another 1.5 million, 2 million Jews. She's got 1.5 million of her own. She says, this is going to be perfect. I'm going to squeeze all these Jews into the same part of Russia up against the German border, so in case there's an invasion, who's going to die first? The Jews. So I'll put them up there. So she's got a plan. She forces resettlement. All the Jews have to live in the same region, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, all up against the Prussian-Austro-Hungarian border. And she forces them into little towns surrounded by poor, miserable, wretched serfs. The Jews are poor, miserable, and wretched, and the serfs are poor, miserable, and wretched. The serfs are still what? We got slavery in the United States still, but who else has got slavery? The Russians. Russians got slavery. They still got slavery. So here the Jews and the serfs are living in abject misery. The word for city or town in Yiddish is Stadt. And they are now forced into smaller towns because they don't want the Jews all gathering in big cities. They want them in little towns. And the Yiddish word for a little town is shtetl. You can pronounce it now because you're going to use it over and over. All of you say shtetl. This is a little Jewish town in the area that's called the Pale of Settlement, where the Jews were forced to live after Catherine the Great made her decision to push all the Jews out. Forced migration. This was kind of ethnic cleansing from the rest of Russia. Shove them up against the border, all the Jews in this crowded, dirty, one gigantic ghetto that the Jews are living in with the miserable old language of Yiddish still there. And this is Catherine the Great's plan for the Jews. The Pale of Settlement and the creation of the tiny little Jewish town or village that was known as the shtetl. The little towns of Poland and Russia. Now, we're getting very close. This is it. Again, more geopolitics. The 19th century, we're in the 19th century. And just a description of 3 czars and the Jews. And these are, what was Russia like? Peter the Great was the only one who ever tried to do anything modern. We got monarchies. What are the monarchies of Europe like? The French wound up killing their king. The Brits, they sort of modernized. They took away power from their monarchs. How would you describe the Russian monarchs? What adjectives would you use? Backwards, horrible, medieval. Really, the czars, Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Worse. They were really some real bad medieval guy. Couldn't get out. And they had slavery. It was the only European country that still had white slavery. They enslaved their white serfs. So it was really a backward, ridiculous kind of an absolute cheek to jowl with one religion. What was the official religion, as it is, and once again, Russian Orthodox. Russian Orthodoxy and the established rule. It was church and state absolutely tight together. We want to look at 3 people. Nicholas I, what was the family, by the way? What was the family name? These were Romanovs. This family had been ruling for centuries, the Romanov family. He ruled for 30 years. He was an autocrat, absolute monarch, absolute autocrat, one czar. He made all the rules, no parliament, no nothing. He believed in one czar, one faith, one nation. And if you didn't like it, you were in trouble. All minorities. There was a considerable Baptist minority in Russia, and they were persecuted. Roman Catholics were persecuted. Everybody was persecuted. And the one group that was really persecuted because they kept so close to their families were the Jews. So he said, the only way to break these people out is to get them away from their family. And he instituted for the Jew a mandatory 25-year draft. You got drafted into the army for 25 years. He said, if that doesn't get them away from their mothers, nothing will. So a mandatory 25-year compulsory draft for the Jews. That was, they tried, but still, the harder you persecuted, the stronger became the bonds and the stronger the ties. They couldn't break it. They still, Nicholas I finally died, and he had tried, an autocrat, a brute, a thug, but he could not break the hold that the rabbis had on the Jews. Then came a miracle. The miracle was Alexander II from 1855 to 1881. He was the Tsar liberator. He freed the serfs. Where do you think he got the idea in 1861 to free the serfs? The American Civil War. American Civil War. He says, we got to do it. It's going to happen in America, and we're going to do it also. He also ended restricted Jewish settlement. He said there is no more Pale of Settlement. The Jews can live anywhere that they want. They can go to school. They can go to school and they can learn Russian. They can do anything that they want. You can have a liberal education. He was the first enlightened Tsar. And in this period, which is considerable, a period of 26 years, he created, or was created, a reasonably large intellectual, secular Jewish class of intellectuals, of writers, of people who knew what language? No, they knew Yiddish, right, David? They knew Yiddish, but now they also knew Russian. And they had correspondences with people like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and they were Jews who were actually intellectuals who were part of Russian civilization and Russian life. And they loved it. They created a whole new... The rabbis were losing control a little bit more. And for 25 years, Alexander II liberalized Russia. They were going in the right direction. For the Jew, the doors were open, and they could do whatever they wanted. And then, 1881, he's assassinated. His brother comes in, Alexander III, worse than the worst. The last autocrat forces the Jews back into the Pale. In May of 1882, May laws, the Jews cannot have professions, the Jews are pariahs, the Jews are bad, the Jews are... And it goes back to the medieval images of the Jew. And all of a sudden, this group of Jewish intellectuals are left out there saying, we can't go back. We're not going to revert back to the old days. What are we going to do? But, who was the Tsar, by the way, after Alexander III? He got assassinated in 1894. Who came in? Nicholas. So what is Russia on the way to? It's on the way to revolution. The next Tsar was Nicholas II, and he was dead. He was the last of the Romanovs. So we're already in the 19th century, and things are really cooking here. Got 15 minutes. I don't know if I'm going to get to it. Russia on the road to revolution, the next Tsar. So the Jewish intellectuals are left out there saying, what are we going to do? How do we write? Who do we write for? How are we going to communicate? Meanwhile, this is a trick line. Meanwhile, in the British Museum, who is sitting in the British Museum coming up with some really extraordinary ideas? It's the age of isms coming to Europe in the 19th century. I put them all down together. Who's sitting in the British Museum? His chair is still there. They got a little plaque over it. Here sat Karl Marx when he was writing. First he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1849. Then in 1867, Das Kapital. You know, you're interesting as a generation. You never lived through the Cold War, the heyday of communism. Communism, Marxism, was an astonishing idea that failed. It's gone. You know, where you got Marxism left today? Which countries are still trying it? Who's still trying the state controlling and distributing all wealth? China's not. What's China? Cuba is still trying. Venezuela is failing. And that's it. There's nobody else doing this thing. You know, what have the Chinese done? What have the Chinese done? They have taken two different economic systems, fused them. They're trying to make totalitarian capitalism work. So we'll see. You'll see in your lifetimes what happens with this thing. Well, that'll be interesting. But Marx, the idea, what's the idea of Marxism? Since it's already gone and failed. When did the walls come down? When did all of it collapse? Collapsed. It died before you were here. It's a date that you should put down like 1941, important dates in your life, even though you weren't alive at the time, when communism failed and left capitalism triumphant. Capitalism triumphant. We become a hegemon because our great enemy, what was the adjective, by the way, always before communism? What was the adjective always used in America? Blank communism. Don't ever forget that America is a religious country. Don't ever forget it. I got your attention, but you're not giving me an answer. Godless communism. Always godless communism. And communism was godless. No, Marx said the worst thing that ever happened to humanity was this opiate. He called it an opiate. He called religion the opiate of the people. He says, this is the opiate of the people. They can do anything to you if you accept it. So he was really hard on this. And it's one of the reasons probably why it never worked in the United States. Left-wing movements, communism, Marxism, socialism, just don't work in this country. The largest vote we ever had for a political president candidate in 1936, in the middle of the Depression, 2% of Americans voted for Norman Thomas. Americans just don't like it. We don't want to do that. We never did. We certainly never will. As much as we try, it's never going to happen. The Communist Manifesto believed in what? The distribution of wealth. Everybody gets what everybody needs, and it's a nice utopian idea. Freud was one of the earliest ones who said, it'll never work. Human nature is not that way. People are too damn selfish. They're not going to want to give you some of their... But it's great. It started at the end of the 19th century. It's important for us because in the stories that we read, the characters begin embracing these ideas. Marxism, the Communist Manifesto, Marx, the whole idea of socialism, and it swept over Europe, and then in the 20th century, it swept over, and then from 1945 on, the USSR, it swept the world. The United States was back on its heels trying to prevent all of this stuff. What was Kennan's policy? We got to try to, George Kennan, we got to contain this thing, contain this idea. We have to let capitalism fight God, because capitalism was Christian, as Max Weber said, the Protestant ethic in capitalism, and communism is godless. So all of this was cooking, and it began cooking at the end of the 19th century. One of the great isms that failed. No question about it, it failed. And it's gone, but you should know as much as you can about how it started, how it captured the mind, particularly of whom? Who did it capture? The minds of young people, students. I mean, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, Cold War, America, then after the college campuses blew up in the 1960s after the Vietnam War, and everybody went right to the left. And Marxism, communism, socialism became the mantra of 2 or 3 generations of students, while others were... It was kind of interesting, messy and sloppy and crazy, but it's part of the history of your parents' generation or grandparents' generation, if you ever talk to them about it. Where were they in the spectrum? It was back and forth, left, right, Ronald Reagan. It was counter movements, all astonishing stuff. But it was the first great ism of the 19th century. Or you could also say Darwinism was a great ism of the 19th century, an attack on religion. This one is the one that's most interesting for us because of our course. Anti-Semitism really got science. Got scientific behind eugenics. It went from theology, praying for the conversion of the Jews, to biology. Biology was really that you were biologically a Jew and you weren't going to try to trade it. Then came this Dreyfus trial in 1894 in France. An obscure captain on the French general staff was arrested and accused of treason. They put him up on trial, and this guy, Theodor Herzl, was a reporter for the Vienna newspaper and went to cover the trial. And he went and covered the trial. Herzl was an assimilated Jew, a skirt chaser, a womanizer, never got bar mitzvahed. He wasn't interested in being Jewish at all. But he went to cover this trial, and he saw signs all in front of the court that said, Mort aux Juifs, which means what in French? Death to the Jews. There's a village in France that's named Death to the Jews, France. It's a little village named after that's called Death to the Jews. And so there it was. When Dreyfus saw this, he said, when Herzl saw this, he said, whoops, we need something else. The Jews need something else. So this guy was the inventor, the creator of Zionism. He only lived 44 years. He wrote, in 1896, he wrote a book called Der Judenstaat in German, because that was the only language he knew, the Jewish state. Herzl was interesting because he was secular. He was not interested in religion. He was not interested in the Holy Land. He wasn't interested in Jerusalem. He went to Jerusalem, he saw people kissing the Holy Wall. He says, I get sick. He didn't like it at all. He said, this is not what I'm interested in. He was interested in a state for Jews, but he didn't care where it was. He was not territorial. But he died at the age of 44. Man plans and God laughs. So at 44, Herzl dies, and that movement that was secular Zionism shifts the other direction. What did he write about in the Judenstaat? He said, my favorite country is Argentina. He thought if the Jews could settle on the Pampas, it would be great. But he would have settled for Uganda, Kenya, South Jersey, Arizona. He would have taken anything he could have gotten, just as that the Jews could get the hell out of Europe, because he felt they weren't going to make it in Europe. So this was an age of isms that were astonishing, just extraordinary. This is a book that could be written for any ethnic group. This book is over 60 years old. It was written in 1950. It's in the book's library. I got about 6 or 7 copies in the book library. It's called Life is with People, the Culture of the Shtetl. Who are the people of the Shtetl? 2 anthropologists, named Borowski and Herzog, at Columbia, did the first oral history. How many of you do oral histories with your family? Do any of you do some oral history with your family? To find out where do we all come from? This was the first academic study of oral history done by 2 anthropologists who sat down with people who were between the ages of 60 and 70 who had come to this country 50 years old or earlier. They were teenagers when they came to this country. They were the first generation of massive Jewish immigration that came over after 1880. And they wanted to find out, what was your value system? And here's what that book revealed: a snapshot of shtetl tradition. Isolation inside the walls. This is the world we're going to be looking at. Simple Hasidic faith, dreaming of Moshiach. The Jews of the shtetl in Catherine the Great's Pale of Settlement, and then, what's his name, Alexander III, dreamed that their misery would be relieved by the coming of the Messiah. When the Messiah comes, all our problems are going to go away. In the meantime, in the village that we're living, the family is the central piece. There's another Yiddish word, or Hebrew word, that's really Hebrew and Yiddish, that you need to repeat after me. Mishpacha. Spit it out. Mishpacha. It means, in Italian, it would be what? Who's Italian? La famiglia. Family. And what family means in its most emotional, controlling, total way. The meaning of family. And in this world, it was patriarchal. Who ruled the family? Right back to Adam and Eve. Who ruled the family? How many of you live in patriarchies? How many of you, well, you wouldn't be you, maybe your parents. How many of your grandparents where the father rules? Or great-grandparents where the father still rules? The father makes the rules. That was the world of the shtetl. The patriarch ruled everything. Family, faith, and tradition. The father's rules determined everything. It's going back again. Eve was the problem, and so the male patriarch, the leader of the family, he communicates most directly with God because the women weren't educated. The only people who got an education were the men. The women weren't educated. It was very much the patriarchal tradition. The microfamily. What do I mean by microfamily? What's the microfamily? The immediate family. What's that made up of? If you have a boy, you're thrilled. Why? We got maybe the next Messiah. Every boy could be a Messiah. Can a girl be a Messiah? Pooey, never. The Messiah is going to be a man. So if you have a boy, wonderful. If you have a girl, whatever you have to do, get rid of her, get her married when she's 10, 11, and 12. That was the average age of marriage in the shtetl. Girls who got married at 12 or 13, they find somebody, get rid of them, let somebody else worry about them. It was a man's world. And very definitely knowing what to expect. You know that you make the rules, the father makes the rules, the children are nothing but extensions of the family. The children exist only to bring honor and no shame to the family. So you are very constricted rules. You say to the family and do what you're told. The macro family is what? What's the macro family? The shtetl itself, the community itself, the community of other families. And what are you looking for there? How to maintain our honor, our dignity, in the midst of all of this poverty and wretchedness. How do we maintain our family's status in here? Poor people desperately need status. So they look for it any way they can. A good marriage, you got a good cow, you got a goat, you got everything. You got a living, a way to do something. Every family is looking for some way to have status, honor, and to keep the walls, which walls, intact. Because above all, you don't want your children mucking around with the goyim. Now, all victim religions or victim ethnicities, ethnicities. Armenians have become victims. Gypsies become victims. Jews in this world became victims. So they all have a word for anybody who's not one of them. For the Jew, anybody who's not one of them is a goy. It's a Hebrew word. For the Gypsies, everybody who is not one of them is called a gaj. The Gaja or the other world. For an Armenian, anybody who's not one of them is an Oda. The Armenians are us, and the Oda are those out there trying to kill us. So the Jews came up with this idea also. They didn't come up with it. They've been living in the ghettos for centuries now. To keep away from the God. How do you do that? You got two sets of walls. The Gentile world has a world around you, and then you as the father or the rabbi, what do? You build another set of walls. God forbid your children should shame you and embarrass you and humiliate you by marrying a goy. And violence, forget it. You let anybody beat up on you who wants to. You're a victim. Everything is God's will. God's will rules everything. Before you lift your hand in violence, let your hand fall off. Conversion is like a death in the family. If you leave or do anything to shame the family, it is death. Not only for the family, but for you. You're dead. You're cut off from the rest of it. The pain is great, but the shame is greater. Don't ever shame the family. That is the value system of the world we're going to be getting into. We didn't get to the last slide. I got one more. I got a whole bunch. Who shaped your... Now I ask you, who shaped your core values? You all probably feel emancipated. You live in America for so long. Where were any of these values in your family's core values? Think about that. I should give you an assignment, but I'm not going to because I haven't talked about the literature yet. So we'll be exactly on schedule when we get back. Just come to class on Tuesday, and we'll get you right to the door. But bring your book with you. Bring your book with you.